All right, Chris, and welcome everyone to the Ministry of Propaganda. This week we are discussing North Korea. Yes, it's good to see you, mate. North Korea, because of course Kim, the leader of the DPRK or North Korea, met with Putin last week to discuss all sorts of things. So in light of that, we thought we would delve a bit into North Korean history and politics and affairs, which regularly comes up in the news and has done for many years. So where do you want to start with this one, Chris?
So this is a really fascinating subject for me and for a lot of people. If you only have to go through YouTube videos to see that any new North Korean content, it's like catnip for the algorithm. People's appetite for North Korean content is everlasting, purely because it's such a unique country. Even amongst socialist countries, it's unique. There's never been a place like it before in its application of socialism and its sort of aesthetic. There's a lot there to, in some ways, admire. There's also a lot there to criticize. I don't think anybody would, apart from the most adamant Juche follower, would argue that there is definitely a democratic deficit, to put it lightly, in Korea. You could argue when the wolves are at the door, democracy tends to come second place, as it has done historically from the days of Caesar onwards. North Korea is, and since its inception, been in a state of siege. Half its country is divided by the Americans across the 58 parallel. So it is half a country. When we are talking about the DPRK, this is just the Korea of the North. This should be one nation, and they still view themselves as that. Obviously, we're going to sort of get into a little bit about why they have almost a porcupine approach to world diplomacy. Obviously, it does sort of match up with its history. There's a very good reason for that, but that is also why now they are becoming quite a potential partner of some sort of the Russian Federation in the situation in Ukraine.
Yeah. I mean, this does all tie, sadly, back to the Ukraine war, as a lot of politics does now. The main reason, again, like I said, we were talking about Putin and Kim meeting. It was primarily because of arms. At least we'll never actually know, and for many years exactly, because of course it's arms. You don't necessarily publish how many shells or what types of weapons are going to be exchanged or purchased or whatever. But this is understood to be a meeting about arms because, if you don't know, North Korea was armed and helped by the Soviet Union. Therefore, a lot of weapons that the North Koreans still use and have in store are Soviet weapons, so Soviet shells and Soviet ammunition, which the Russians also use. So yes, that's a key part of this whole discussion. And as you said, a sort of new partnership or a new dawn in the partnership, an old partnership. Actually, I'm not sure to read out some of the stuff that the official channel, the official statements made by Putin and Kim too, is that they were, of course, he acknowledged celebrating the 75th anniversary of its founding, and Putin made a point of reminding that it was actually his country, which I find quite interesting here. This our country was the first to recognize the sovereignty and independence of the People's Republic of Korea, the DPRK, which of course technically it was the Soviet Union, but I guess they've taken on the mantle. But it's an important point. It shows you that this is a very old partnership, despite this feeling like something new. Putin and Kim meeting, the last time they met was actually in 2001, if I'm not mistaken. So it's an old partnership from the Soviet Union, but also having a new skin or a new era, let's say.
Like you said, that is a very interesting sort of distinction to make. That it reminds me of last month where Putin said regarding the situation in Africa, where he announced that he's going to be basically re-energizing Soviet-era relationships with African nations. And now that wording of almost showing a state of continuity between the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation, as if they are a morphing of the previous rule, which they aren't. It's really, but in terms of very few actual figures, like a lot of it down to age. Like Putin was obviously a member of the KGB and member of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union by choice of that. He needed that for his job, and he would have never been allowed in the KGB without that membership. But it's not as if the members of the previous Politburo or of Supreme Soviet running the country now. This is, for all intents and purposes, a new guard. For whatever reason, Putin is choosing to use a lot of Soviet sort of nostalgia, even in his diplomacy now, alluding to the notion that Soviet relationships are Russian Federation relationships, and that it was the Russian Federation in sort of spirit of history who helped Korea liberate itself from Japanese occupation. And it's not a bad thing. In fact, there's a lot to be gained by almost alluding to Soviet nostalgia and Soviet nationalism in some ways, especially in the situation where Russia is at the moment.
Definitely. It's a huge wealth of historical solidarity and historical goodwill that they're drawing from, particularly in Africa, but also elsewhere in the world. Yeah, it is a wealth. It was a big investment back in the past, not an investment in the business sense. They put a lot of resources, the Soviet Union and the other Eastern Bloc countries, to national liberation struggles and fighting against the imperialists, mainly America. There's a lot to gain from that now. It's smart to do that. Even though, as you said, it's not necessarily. I do feel there's a bit of something missing there with the fact that they're claiming all of that, and it's like, well, you also have discarded a lot, so you're kind of picking and choosing which parts of the Soviet history you want to honor and use.
It is something that Putin has always done, even to the shock of when Yeltsin was alive. The national anthem, for instance, the fact that they still use the old, what was originally the Bolshevik Party anthem, which then became the Soviet national anthem, which is now the Russian Federation anthem, even written by the same man.
Right.
So he's always done this. So it's nothing new. It does come across sometimes as quite dishonest when you are taking credit for something that you have no credit to be taken. Like the Russian army is not the Red Army, and sometimes it's good to make that distinction that the merits of one doesn't automatically pass on to the successors. One, the Red Army was not exclusively Russian.
Sure.
Ukrainians.
The Ukrainians were in there. Yes. Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah. This thing of the past and then how he uses it is, I mean, as you just said, the national anthem, but he also does have, I think recently you've seen this thing of even flying the old Russian imperial flag has been used in some stuff. So I think a lot of this is also just is to try to craft a new image. But also, I do think that Putin himself has changed too. So Putin in the early 2000s was trying to wanted Russia to become a Western nation, quote unquote. The G8, if we remember that, it was something once upon a time. And it's actually the West who has actually turned and created this version of Putin, the deeply anti-Western Putin. He once wanted.
They pushed him away first before he did this.
He wanted a liberal democracy or a liberal capitalist society, at least.
Yeah.
And he was pushed because, the West actually wanted to break up Russia. They didn't want this form of Russia, any strong form of Russia. They wanted a Balkanized, Yugoslavia-styled breakup, which is what they wanted 100 years ago. But I think we've kind of said some of these things before. I just wanted to mention something that in reply to the opening comments or the first comment made by Putin, the comments made by Kim, is that he said, Russia is currently engaged in a sacred battle to defend its state sovereignty and security in the face of the hegemonic forces that oppose Russia. We are willing to continue to develop our relations. We have always supported and will continue to support every decision made by Putin, as well as the decisions of the Russian government. I also hope that we will always stand together in fighting imperialism and building a sovereign state. So, yeah, I think if you look at the voting record of the UN General Assembly, and as you'd expect with how things are right now, the North Koreans, of course, are seeking to support the Russians and seeing their fight against America as something that they can definitely support. Just a quick point I'd like to make is that people were identifying this visit by Putin to North Korea, backward, crazy North Korea, as a sign of weakness, showing that the Russians don't have enough shells, the Russians are running out of ammo. They're going to the North Koreans. Of all the people, they're going to the North Koreans. We have to remind ourselves that the South Koreans were already asked to provide shells in that leaked document, or the leaked documents back in March of this year.
We showed that at the time.
Exactly. The Americans were already requesting shells from South Korea 6 months ago. So, I mean, obviously, you might say then that they've been doing this behind the scenes, that the Kim and Putin have been meeting behind the scenes and whatever. But I don't know. All we know is right now, the most obvious sign that they actually are asking for shells is happening right now. But
in terms of the statement that you just read there, this is the sort of language that we're used to from North Korea. They constantly will talk about struggles against imperialism. This sort of classic Marxist terminology. But we're not from Russia, in a long time. So to almost hear a country that is historically fought for its national liberation back on a platform with a superpower, it is sort of a refreshing change of pace, because Russia hasn't, even for the past couple of decades of the Soviet Union, didn't talk like this. Under Gorbachev and the few old men before him, until probably Brezhnev in the 70s. So this is revitalizing, and just to sidetrack slightly as well, at the same time, we're now having Bashar al-Assad, who is on a visit at the moment, currently in China. We are seeing this emboldenment of the anti-imperialist alliances in the world, and it is a positive step. No matter what some people might think of North Korea, I know even amongst self-proclaimed leftists and Marxists and communists who will gladly go out leafleting with a Che Guevara t-shirt, for some reason it's not sexy to give that same support to North Korea. They'll say, "Oh, we love Fidel Castro, love Che Guevara, but Kim Il Sung, that's too far." And I don't understand how that has happened.
Yeah. I mean, I guess there are criticisms to make of as you already mentioned, the democratic deficit and whatnot. But I think also a part of this is that the North Korean is the most demonized. So, and I think also they do, because of their isolationist sort of, like you said, porcupine sort of posturing. It's difficult for, I guess, a lot of these communist leftist people that would like to support them to find the common ground and to find the truth. Because even doing this, prepping for this, it's extremely difficult to find data from a third party. So, not that I don't believe the North Korean government, but obviously if you're trying to convince someone and you say, well, look at this and this and this, and it's North Korean state data, they can just say, well, of course they say that. So I think that might be a part of it, is that, being isolationist and then being only observations and only information you get is from its enemies. It's difficult to try and find, things.
There is almost like a slight truism that's emerged from the notion of state media, particularly North Korean state media, which is almost a meme in its how sort of it is the example of the over-the-topness of state media. So I did show you this the other day, so I just wanted to show people this small clip, just to get out of if we do want anything to sort of lightly poke fun at, we'll just get it done early, just so we can get it out of our system.
Sure, yeah,
I thought it was actually quite poetically beautiful in how many words they can use to say not very much at all.
Okay.
The senior officials of the party, the government, and the military, representing the unanimous mind of the entire people across the country, and the officers and men of the People's Army, offered warm congratulations to Kim Jong Un, who came back in good health after conducting immortal external revolutionary activities to shine forever in the history of strengthening and development of the DPRK-Russia friendship.
That is beautiful.
The immortal revolutionary activities.
External. That if anyone ever asks me where I'm going to go out and conduct external revolutionary activities.
Immortal external revolutionary activities. Yeah, I mean, this is the stuff that for other people from different cultures, Western cultures or whatever, this stuff does look comical. It's not something that we.
I think what makes it more comical is the fact, because obviously this is in English, so this is for a foreign audience.
Yeah, this was made for us. Yeah.
Obviously, this is the sort of negative of. I'm now telling people not to do exactly what we've just done, of just taking something at face value and saying this entire government is ridiculous because of how comical we can perceive one aspect to it. But obviously it serves a real historical function. Something has gone on here, and this is why North Korea looks and acts this way. So obviously, do you want to do a little bit, dive into a little bit of history now, just for
the history? Yeah, sure. Let's do a little bit of history. I've got some points to come back to later when we talk about just the current situation again. But yeah, let's go into the history there. I'll just say before we dive in is the when we did our episodes on the royal family and the Queen, particularly our passing more than nearly a year ago, whenever that was, we also observed the fact that those traditions and that pageantry is also ridiculous. Sort of the Lord of the Thistle and this sword, a magical sword being carried by someone in a magical hat, is equally weird and kind of comical as some of the stuff that the pageantry.
We made this comparison. If you find any pageantry cringeworthy and laughable, you find it all. I don't see this any different to that, and I don't find this any worse than that or better than that. It's
sure.
If you're going to ever call anybody your excellency or your highness as you would an ambassador from another country, if you've ever even been to court, I can't even call them your honor. I find that level of pomp and ceremony it's a barrier that I struggle to cross.
Sure. So yeah, what did you want to go into for the history? Where do you want to start?
Yeah. So first off, like we said, that Korea is a divided nation. So after World War II, well, during the occupation of Korea, it was occupied by the Japanese. They set up absolute horrendous conditions all over Korea. One of the things that they did, which they've never apologized for, they set up what's called comfort stations, which is sexual slavery all over the country to service Japanese men, Japanese soldiers. There was massacres repeatedly. So eventually, Kim Il-sung and many others started a guerrilla band towards the Chinese mountains. They launched, honestly, not tremendous attacks. Like some of these statues that you see in North Korea of the attacks that they launched, the statues are almost to scale. Like you'll count like 12 soldiers where there was actually like 20. So they were small. The Koreans will sort of sometimes have you believe that the Koreans liberated themselves. They did so with the overwhelming support of the Soviet Union. But after the war, there was elections set up throughout the whole country, and the United Socialist Party won. In response to that, the Americans, who occupied the South, banned the communists, which forced them all up north. So eventually the North, in 1955, declared their own state. So when the Korean War...
45.
What did I say?
55. So, because obviously the war was... Okay.
The war was...
Sorry, did you say after the war? Sorry, I missed that. Sorry. After the Civil War. Sorry, the Korean War. I got you.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
So the Korean War itself, this is where American history gets very iffy, because obviously the narrative that people always say is that the war started when the North attacked the South. First off, you can't attack your own country. It's a divided country. You cannot physically invade your own country. It is your country. That's the first point of contention. The second point, even the Wikipedia on the art admits itself that the reports of that day is confused about who fired first, because original reports were that the South Korean army attacked the North first. Well, if that literally is the start of the skirmish, then you can't then come out at the end of it and declare the North to be the ones who attacked first, when that is still up in the air. But it is a moot point, because, like I say, you can't attack your own country.
Right.
So obviously, the war ended how we all know, ended basically in a stalemate with the borders not moving very much. The North would have been effectively annihilated if it wasn't for the Chinese joined the war. A tremendous amount of manpower. And
well, actually, I would like to just go into some detail on that one. So, as a broad stroke, once the war broke out, the northern forces were about to take and win. They had them in that port down south. I think it's Quezon, not Quezon, is it? I've forgotten the name of the port, but it's a port into what's now South Korea, the other major city. And only because the UN actually was deployed to fight this was the UN's first major deployment, and that included, obviously, of course, the British and all sorts. But only because of international intervention did they manage to hold on and then push the North Koreans north, almost to the Chinese border, and that's where the Chinese came in, because they saw it as a direct threat. And also, particularly MacArthur. This is why Mao and the Chinese chose to intervene, because MacArthur was very aggressive and saw this as that they needed to push as far as they could.
He wanted to use nuclear weapons on China, didn't he? He was literally mad.
Yeah, they had to sack him. They had to sack him because of it. Yeah.
What I find interesting about MacArthur, well, on this is a lot of if you watch a lot of like war films or even play World War II games, a lot of the stories you hear when they say, "Oh, the Soviets did this," like shooting your own men. Like if you watch Enemy at the Gate or play Company of Heroes, the Soviets can shoot more of their own men than the enemy did, which historically didn't happen. But it did in Korea. MacArthur literally passed that order for his own men to be shot. Also, the thing about having more men than guns, MacArthur was literally sending men in doubled up. Pick up your comrade's gun when he falls and starts shooting. He was literally mad. He was the most fierce anti-communist that it was just. It was rabid. And like I said, he was sacked because the Americans couldn't reel him in. He would have.
He would have started. Nuclear war. Yeah.
Have you ever seen what's the film with Stanley Kubrick, Dr. Strangelove?
I haven't. No.
Well, he was essentially like the character in that film who takes over an American base without the government knowing to drop bombs on the Soviets to cause a war. And he's like, no, this is all in the Americans' good. That's him. He is the general who would have taken it on his own shoulders to cause World War III.
Right. And that very nearly happened. Yeah. So, sorry to jump in. So let's go back to the general course then. So obviously the war then goes north and goes south, and then it sort of stabilizes, to use that better term, or sort of not stalemated, but the fighting intensified around the current line to the point where they sacked MacArthur, and then the Americans said, "Well, okay, let's have an armistice." Yeah.
Yes, and that's it. It's an armistice, so it's never been a peace treaty. It's all an armistice. It's stalemate. It's a ceasefire. Normally, as the armistice of, if any Europeans who know the armistice of the end of World War One, an armistice normally is a temporary agreement while you formulate a permanent peace plan. But that peace plan never happened in Korea. So they built a DMZ, demilitarized zone. It's a joke because it's the most militarized zone in the actual world. So named accordingly. And that is where the two Koreas have faced off till now. And through various degrees of development until the 70s. Korea was actually the most. North Korea was the most economic development, where the South was under a military dictatorship under Sun Yat-sen. And obviously, there's been so much sabotage that's gone from both sides of the border. There've been attacks from the north to the south, such as the Olympic plane that was attacked by the north, and Americans who have been found to be sabotaging the north's agricultural supply, getting farmers during the average March in the 90s when the famine was happening to cut off the tails of their oxes on the border, saying, if you bring us tails, we'll pay you. Of course, the farmers, they didn't realize why they were being asked for oxes' tails. They just thought, weird request. Of course, if you cut the tail off an ox, it can't balance anymore, which means you can't use it to till your land. So they were getting uneducated North Korean farmers to sabotage their own agriculture without even realizing that that's what they were doing.
Right.
So the North have been incredibly wary. Obviously, the Soviet Union fell in 91. There's a little bit of revision in North Korea of the idea of juche. It was a concept that was mentioned in passing a few times by Kim Il-sung in the 70s. But when his son Kim Jong-il, was coming into power, he really amped it up and sort of revised history to make it sound like it was always the state ideology. Now, what juche is, in an honest analysis, if I had someone like Dr. Derbert Hudson on here, he'd be arguing with me for that it's a Korean application of Marxism or so. If you've ever been to university, you went to university, didn't you?
Yeah.
Handed in a paper. Do you know when you've got a word count of 2,000, but you've only written 1,500? So you start adding words that don't need to be in. Korea, right. The UK idea is that it is a book that is meant to be pointed at and not read. The whole idea of juche is to not be in the middle of a Soviet and Chinese argument. We're not Khrushchevites. We're not Maoists. We're our own thing. That isn't going to get in the way of you guys. And when the Soviet Union fell and China started to open up in its own way, then they could start advertising themselves as the last man standing. So it was a rebrand for its own purposes. If it advertised itself as linked ideologically to the Soviet Union, in its head, it made it more likely to have followed the Soviet Union. So that's how it is to me. When you honestly read juche, as someone who studies Marxist texts, you don't get that same level of depth from it. It's very. If you ask anyone what it means, they'll say, "Oh, it's all about self-reliance and man being the master of his own world." So that's what it says in the first paragraph of the book, because that's all you've actually read, because the rest of it is kind of just repeating the same thing over and over again.
Right.
So it is, for most part, useless to reference. The fact that it's called self-reliance, which the word juche means, is almost a laugh. The fact that we've just started this talking about a very essential deal that they're making with the Russians.
Yes.
Korea wouldn't have been able to ever develop if it wasn't for the help of the Soviet Union and China. It depends very much on its allies.
Yes.
And it would do China and Russia a disservice to pretend that Korea did this by its own bootstraps, because it didn't. It did this with its friends.
Right. Yeah, I think it's a good point. Yeah, what you just said there, particularly sort of, self-reliance. And as you said, we're talking about a meeting where they're trading potentially for rocket parts, potentially for space travel, potentially for what? Yeah. I think also that's probably one of my criticisms of the ideology itself. I mean, it is good to have self-reliance and to be able to not be vulnerable to your enemies with, relying on them for whatever products or commodities that you may do so. But in terms of sort of an efficiency thing, this is more of an economics kind of argument, is that there are certain things which you shouldn't try and make yourself. Like, if you are in the mountains of North Korea in the winter, should you really be trying to grow bananas? Probably not. like, you should import those and trade in some form with a nation that is more efficient. Because is it productive labor to try and do that? There are certain things that certain countries just because of the conditions.
You don't import ice cubes from the desert.
Exactly. And trying to make them there, it's waste of your own labor from a Marxist sense, I think.
Yeah,
so
completely.
I think
like if you look at the economic makeup of the Soviet bloc, of the socialist bloc, in its heyday, it did sort of delegate resources to develop where they are from. You have
Cubans for sugar, Russians for oil. Yeah.
And Korea was part of that, and that's what I mean. There's a lot of revisionism to sort of pretend that they weren't, and they did it all themselves.
Yeah. So I don't know. I'm not an expert on the North Korean economy and how it's got and where it's going, but I don't know. It seems to me that if they could reintegrate themselves in their own way to a global production system, whichever way they want, they should. But then again, this comes down to then why they can't, because of sanctions. So in a sense, maybe they actually would like to, but they don't have a choice, because of course they have other. I stand to be corrected, but I imagine that they are the most sanctioned country in the world.
I would would guess that that's probably correct. And it's not like they had the choice, because as it's been sort of said within factionalism within Korea before, when people have compared why didn't they go the same way that sort of China went or Vietnam went, of economically sort of opening up with each other. But Korea, to an extent, chose not to. To another extent, was sanctioned so much because Vietnam won its war. Once South Vietnam wasn't an entity anymore, that threat was sort of removed. But North Korea hasn't. So it can't, to its own belief, can't risk relaxing itself in the same manner. Because South Korea wants to be Korea. It wants to be the only Korea. It doesn't, particularly in this day and age, want North Korea to collapse due to what it would see as nearly 30 million refugees flooding its border.
Sure.
Which is what would happen if the North collapsed. And I don't think anybody wants to see that. I think what would be more likely to happen if the North Korean government, if there was ever something like a military coup attempt in North Korea, I think, to be honest, I think the Chinese would be more tempted to feel the need to step in.
Well, I think that's an important thing there, like you said. So the South are apprehensive about a collapse in North because, as you said, 30 million refugees and all sorts of other effects. The same goes to the Chinese. They don't want to have the same problem. So
the South border moving towards them, because that puts American military.
The other part, yes, and that's of course why the original intervention. So as much as the Americans intervened and pushed the North, the Chinese intervened and pushed that border back for very much the same reasons. I mean, of course, there is an element of solidarity in fighting imperialism, but I think on a geopolitical level too, they didn't want a hostile nation to be that close and to be bigger. But I like the point you make there about, I think maybe people don't necessarily look at it like that, is looking at the three big Asian sort of Cold War conflicts, which is Vietnam, Korea, and China too, which was a bit earlier, I suppose, where, a communist force was fighting a nationalist force, nationalists being backed by the West, and of course, a communist force backed by the Soviet Union. And as we know, the Vietnamese outcome, which is, full reunification and a country run under communist lines, but also self-determined. The Chinese almost getting that, just the last island that they didn't, reach the natural conclusion, almost again, but the Americans stopped. And I think only because it's got an ocean did they not, were they not able to actually reach the conclusion. And then, of course, the Korean example is the most fraught one. But I think that in terms of trying to describe the problems of the country, like you said, because it is the most frozen in the middle of the fight, and it's the South with thousands of American troops and with a nuclear deterrent guarantee. So the Americans have often said that they're willing to.
It's sort of condition. It's sort of more comparable to what East Germany was in the terms of it's a big open border that is just literally the hub of the opposition making its way in, and Korea never wants that. Luckily, Korea has a set border, where if you look at the GDR's border and how far into the GDR Berlin is, and then you think that's actually a shared city. It's like, well, this was never going to work. This was always
right.
But if that was me back then, and if I was in charge of that decision making, I think I would have just taken the hit of sanctions and said, no, you're having the border at the actual country border, and we're just taking Berlin.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they tried, right? The Berlin airlift and whatnot. They did try. Yeah.
It was always a spy's paradise, and obviously that's what the North want to avoid.
Yeah. And of course, the imperialists, particularly the Americans, would love and are waiting and are sort of cannot. I can't even imagine the fantasies they have of what would they want to do if North Korea managed to break down the expansion that they would have, the change in geopolitics too. It'd be a huge hit to China. It would be the cracking of through the ceiling, so to speak. But
and one thing that I will say that can be quite unpopular in general discourse regarding nuclear weapons. Now, if more countries treated nuclear weapons the way Korea did, the world would actually be a lot safer. They are literally the epitome of the MAD theory of mutually assured destruction. Like, the first one to drop your gun is the one who gets shot. And Libya got destroyed and Gaddafi was killed because they gave up their nuclear weapons. Saddam Hussein was hung and Iraq was destroyed because they got rid of theirs.
Yeah.
And if it was always this case of, we just don't want countries to have, or what they would consider rogue countries to have nuclear weapons, that's completely ignoring the fact that Israel has nuclear weapons
and
never admitted to it.
Yeah, right.
Well, even ignoring that low-hanging fruit, Pakistan has nuclear weapons, and they hate India, who also have nuclear weapons. If that was allowed to exist,
yeah. Right. I think we've probably mentioned that before. That the only reason that North Korea still is there is because they have nukes. So it is a deterrent, even for the superpower. It is.
Of course, it is. And we're at the stage now that Korea have offered to get rid of them before. In the 90s, they got rid of their nuclear program within a deal with the Americans. And the deal was for America to deliver fuel rods to the North so they could say, okay, so we can use them to develop a nuclear energy system. And the Americans agreed to it and said, and they never delivered them. And that's a matter of public record. They just never arrived. So the Koreans thought, well, we'll just restart our program again then.
Yeah.
And so the West will always say, the North, just every time they want something, they fire a nuke, and that brings people to the negotiation table. It's not even that anymore. Like, the Koreans don't care if you come to the negotiation table. They're not testing nukes, so you come and offer something. They're testing nukes, so if they ever need them, they work.
I mean, wouldn't you say it's a bit of both? Because I do think that's that. Of course, there's a capability side.
Yeah,
but I don't know. I do think that they
I can't think of the last time anything was offered to them. Like under Kim Jong Un, there was a lot of those negotiations. The Americans going to meet Kim Jong Il he wants something so that he'll exchange. And that hasn't happened under Kim Jong Un. I can't think of. He's only met the Americans twice. Both of them was Trump, and it was an honest negotiation, and none of it was really about nukes, and it didn't go anywhere. But it was there hasn't really been that under Kim Jong Un.
Yeah, right. Well, I think I suppose we're moving away from the history stuff and kind of just going into stuff. So I did actually want to bring this up. So I think that this whole thing of diplomacy and where the nukes lie in that is that, I mean, this is a bit of a theory in my part, but seeing Putin and Kim together, I mean, the first observation is that it's kind of like a naughty boys club, basically, because it's now Putin meeting with Kim. But the irony here, well, not the irony, but the thing I sort of observed is Putin is actually in more trouble, diplomatically speaking. He can't visit anyone who's a signatory of the ICC. So Kim is actually less in the naughty chair than Putin is right now, which is, I think, the first time ever. I don't think there's ever been a time where any leader meeting Kim is the more sanctioned or the more more in trouble. From the
I don't
eyes of the
think Kim
West.
Jong Un has a international criminal warrant after him, does he?
Right. So that means actually Putin can visit less countries than Kim, which is quite crazy to think about. But
so Kim,
as we
if
know,
he wanted to, could go to visit America. He could go to visit South Africa or any European country if the invite was there.
Obviously, I don't think the armored train can get to South Africa easily, but if you wanted to, but but the thing I want to get at here is, of course, the naughty kids club is growing. I mean, you're already talking about rubles for oil for rubles and oil for yuan. BRICS is building up this new economic system. So the naughty kids club is something that actually is more of a club now, rather than just these rogue nations. You have the rogue alliance, perhaps. But is also, so why did they go to the Cosmodrome? It's a clear message. Here's rockets, here's rocket technology, space technology, and a lot of the journalists from all walks of publication were asking, so are we going to be providing them with space technology? Are we going to be providing them with rockets? I think in addition to the ammunition,
satellite launch, hadn't they?
They did. They just failed one. So the Russians, launch satellites very successfully. Lots of them. They have had the tech for more than 50 years. So I do think that actually, the standard narrative for North Korean diplomacy is firing rockets and doing tests. There's obviously a capability side, but I do think there's a diplomatic side. So because it makes the US have to respond, and it's the only tool they have.
Even when you look at historically, going back into the Soviet American, the space race, they always talk about the space race and the arms race as if they were two different things. That they were almost excuses for each other. Like the reason why the Soviets sending Yuri Gagarin into space was scary for the Americans is because it's the notion, well, if we can send someone into space, then this missile can also hit you because it's transferable technology. So that's the sort of the worry for the Americans, isn't it? If North Korea say they want to have a rocket that can put a satellite in space, that means it can also hit anyone.
Right. Well, exactly. I mean, and also then there's things like hypersonic missiles, and just standard ICBM. So I mean, I don't remember the latest version of the rockets that the North Koreans have and how far it can go. But I know that the Russian ones are global, so they can go anywhere and deliver huge payloads. So they do have far superior tech on the rocket side. So the point I'm trying to get at is the standard narrative is that the North Koreans use nuclear diplomacy to try and get the Americans to negotiate. But you could see that maybe Putin is using the North Koreans as his, nuclear negotiation tool. So he says in over Ukraine and over other issues regarding American-Russian relations. So he's gone to North Korea to scare the Americans to saying, okay, well, you might
North Korea nukes or better missiles
or space stations or any other, high tech that would expand the capabilities, dramatically.
So I think one of the suggestions that was posed was the notion that the Russians would send the first North Korean to space for them, which of course would be the parade-worthy outcome for North Korea. So they've got their Yuri Gagarin.
Sure.
But obviously, like I say, there's the military application to all that. The North Koreans want rockets with a bigger distance.
I mean, I do think that's possibly what is a part of what's going on right now, is that the Russians have created a new chess piece that the Americans have to consider, just as they have.
I don't think it's an empty gesture. I don't think it's just to get the Americans to negotiate, or I will give them these weapons. Because like we said months ago, regarding the chip crisis that is going on in the world, of the microchip shortages, which goes back into China and Taiwan, because the majority of microchips are made in Taiwan. But the North Korean weapons, you'd be damn sight to find any weapon in North Korea with a microchip in it. Right. They will be compatible with the most basic of Russian munitions. And they've been stockpiled since the end of the Korean War. So you've literally got 50, 60 years worth of artillery to fall back on here. I mean, that's a tremendous amount. I think when people forget about, when they think about war and they don't realize the amount of waste in terms of shells that goes on, that you can see pictures of like from World War One of piles of spent artillery shells, the amount that you can go through in a day if you've got them.
Yes.
And if the Koreans send a train full of these, that is literally a godsend for the Russian army right now.
It definitely is. And I mean, I think specifically the North Korean army does have, it obviously adopts a variation of Soviet doctrine, which is artillery heavy. And they've, and as you said, they're not necessarily, I mean, they do have some high tech. They do have these submarines and some missiles and whatnot, and I'm sure other tech too. But they have built, a sort of conventional Soviet-styled military, which has got piles and piles of shells. So that's a big boost in supply for the Russians. Which means that potentially it might change the outcome of certain counteroffensives and offensives that are coming this year or perhaps early next year, depending on how the war goes.
But, hopefully the Koreans aren't just negotiating just for rocket technology. I'd hope to see a few trains full of wheat going in as well, because obviously that's always, you can't eat rocket technology.
Right.
I hope that more tangible is going on, but obviously Russia could provide that. And with the situation now we're entering the phase of sanctions be damned. We're all sanctioned to death anyway, so let's do what we want.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, and also an outcome that the North Koreans are going to benefit from is when that global infrastructure, financial infrastructure is, more developed, more established, the BRICS systems or the systems that the Russians are already using, that means that the North Koreans can no longer have to worry about that economic isolation. They can actually, go and take part in the Russian economy or global economy, whatever you want to call it, the BRICS economy. So that's also something that's going to, if things continue as they are, that will be something that the North Koreans can do. So that would change the country massively. That would be very good for them. Yeah.
There's a very interesting sort of look into the future there. Like we've just seen Iran and Saudi Arabia join BRICS. I can easily see 5 years, maybe more down the line of North Korea and maybe Syria joining as well.
Likely.
That is literally how he.
Yeah.
I think as soon as America start to play silly games of sanctions with China again, I think that's when those sort of things will be going out the window and be like, well, we'll just trade amongst ourselves.
Yeah, and I think also the as we already alluded to earlier, with the fact that after the Soviet collapse, that the North Koreans did have, this is their deepest part of economic hardship, and this whole thing of self-reliance being a product of that. If we talk about the end of the end of the unipolar world, the American world, also means then for the North Koreans the end of that sort of need to be so autarkic and to have some of the hardship that they have. It would actually be perhaps a brighter future for them. So that's
completely. Like when the wolves are off the door, you can afford this. So like one of the big military doctrines, political doctrines, really in Korea is called Shongun, which literally translates to military first. Which it's not particularly deep. It's exactly what it sounds like on the tin. It's given the military the first pickings of resources in the country. Their sort of reasoning is the military are the revolutionary force in the country. Maoists would say the peasantry, traditional Marxist-Leninists would say the proletariat. North Koreans say the army, which is very convenient if you fear getting power removed. But whatever the reason, I suppose if you've got everyone in your country in your army, then it's kind of true.
Right.
So yeah, in a situation where those border tensions are eased, then resources can be allocated to a more needing section of society.
Yeah. I mean, and also this is the same criticism that many people have made of the Soviet Union, that more could have been spent on economic development and consumer goods had they not had this military, global arms race, nuclear arms race.
Yeah.
So yeah,
it's almost for the same reasoning. I mean, like the reason the Soviet Union and before it the Russian Socialist Republic felt a need to have this military doctrine and this aesthetic communist look that everyone's got in their head of a communist soldier is because as soon as they had a revolution, America, Britain, and 17 other countries attacked them. They literally never got a moment's peace from day one.
It was to survive.
Of course, after this is where Marxists realized that to not defend your gains it's almost irresponsible.
Yes. Yeah. Well, it is responsible. Yeah. And history has shown that the ones who didn't protect themselves or take their security appropriately didn't last and didn't survive and were couped and were destroyed and were bombed.
Exactly.
So in that sense, the North Korean position makes in that historical sense does make perfect sense that they need to protect themselves from the outside.
This is why the sort of history is so important, because if you just look at where you are now without people understanding why they are like that, then it's just easy to dismiss them. So it's just a big military dictatorship. So well, it's not, and there's much more nuance to it. That you've got to look at why something is the way it is before you write it off.
Exactly. No, exactly. Yeah, I think just with North Korea, it's harder because of the lack of information, basically.
Yeah, they don't make it easy for themselves.
Right.
So,
and I mean, and bear in mind, you have similar assumptions, theories, conspiracies, just lies spread about countries like Vietnam and China. And if you go to these places, you go there and you expect to see certain things, and actually they're not true. So I've visited both of these places and lived in one of them. It takes a while, even if you're there, to sort of start to get rid of these things. You go, well, maybe the government is doing this, or maybe it's not. So imagine with North Korea, the level of lies and conspiracy and falseness that is kept in our heads because we don't have, of course, the ability to dispel it as easily. So it's difficult to dispel things in the very open socialist Vietnam. It's almost impossible to try and do that with a closed.
An aesthetic does a lot of sort of damage too, because in the West everything's boiled down to an aesthetic. So if something looks like what you think that thing looks like, then you just automatically write it off. Like fascism is a great one. As soon as you say to fascism to someone, they've got instant ideas of brown uniforms, goose-stepping troops, and then if something doesn't look like that, they'll never associate it in their head as fascism. Where modern fascism very rarely looks like that. They're mostly wearing business suits.
Yes, right.
So it throws them off, because in their head, if it looks like that, then it's that. If they've got red flags, and then even in North Korea, if they're goose-stepping, it's totalitarianism. It's that, because our simple boiled down media has got you to just associate one thing with that, and it's very hard to break that sort of cycle.
Yeah. Okay. Any final thoughts before we close?
No, not really. Other than sort of, as always, these things are constantly evolving. As I pointed out, everything is Ukraine these days. So no matter what we talk about next week, I'm sure it'll be back to Ukraine in some way, shape, or form. We can't get away from it.
Right. But yes. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you, Chris.
Right. I shall see you soon.